Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, yes they did. They absolutely got it right here on Liberty Works Radio Network, where liberty, it does absolutely work for you. And this is, once again, Tom Navolis, your host. And as I mentioned to you last week, this is the day that we 100% pull out of Facebook. 100% pull out of Facebook. Here it is, Saturday, September, 1st? And September 1st, Saturday, September 1st, and we're pulling out of Facebook, as I said. Now, some people have questioned and gone, well, you know, Tom, all of that is interesting, but, you know, this is the only place we can stay in touch with family. This is the only place we can do this. This is the only place we can do that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me just go down this path, and because some people have even questioned, how is it that I can even talk from a point of technology? So what I'm going to do today is, with that opening of pulling out of Facebook 100% now on September 1st, is that I'm going to talk about some of the different things that have been happening. Something that happened this past week, I saw in a Thursday article that the president is taking on the tech titans for the purposes of the future of America. That's something we should be doing ourselves. That is something that, if we're standing on principle, and if the millions of people that voted for Donald Trump would take and pull off of Facebook and go to an alternative source of media communication and interaction, then we would have a significant impact on what is happening with these so-called masters of the universe. Just Tom Navolis taking and pulling off of Facebook, and Kathy pulling off of Facebook, is that going to have really any effect? Probably not. I mean, I had 1,500 friends. Kathy had, how many friends did you have on Facebook, Kath? You know, maybe 300 or so. Is that going to have an effect? No. Because what Facebook has done over the last 6 to 8 months, in particular, has only given you a sphere of influence around, 10 people? Maybe a dozen people? Other than that, who really sees your posts? People were wondering, well, geez, you know, what is it with my content, and why isn't anybody ever getting back to me, and so on and so forth. So the algorithms that they designed was not only to enhance your viewing experience and your content experience, but it was to take and pigeonhole you inside this certain box that, in effect, you did not get all of the content of all your other friends. It only went to those, again, that you chose in particular, and you had to make that choice. Otherwise, they made the choice for you based on how often you would interact with those people. And then they would take and choose for you according to that which they thought, based on your profile, you needed, in their estimation, to see and hear. All very interesting. So I think we're going to, talk about that a little bit more, and I'll talk in the next couple of segments on some of the different articles that are out there relative to all this area of social media. And then we're going to also today talk a little bit about virtue and morality and social justice as it was understood by our founding fathers. I'll try and weave that in there in the second segment in particular. But let's do a little bit of a credibility check. Let's do that. I think that that's a fair thing to do. People have asked, well, Tom, what gives you the right to be able to talk about technology, and what do you know about it anyway in the first place? Interesting. I always say, okay, interesting. So let me go back a little bit after the time that I got out of the military in the mid 80s. I was out there working, trying to find a job, saw that technology was kind of a interesting thing to do. And I did technology courses. I learned how to build computers. I learned how to program computers down at the ones and zeros level. I learned how to network computers together. And back in the 80s, mid 80s, that wasn't an easy thing to do. I actually used and set up all the digital database and spreadsheet, stuff at that time, whatever it was, star word or star this or, spreadsheet star something or another way back in the day were the real simple things and real simple database stuff. And I even used it for business in one of the businesses that I started back in the mid 80s. So that's interesting. Well, there's a lot of people that know how to do that. I mean, even 9 and 10-year-olds know how to take and set up computers and do programming and, all that stuff. Yeah, okay. So what happened was I had an opportunity along the way is to get into the telecommunications industry. And I went in as a network administrator, knowing very, very little, if you will. But over the course of my time in telecommunications and going in as a network administrator, I learned all of the various intricacies of developing not only local area networks, corporate networks, how to do at that time client server development. So you were talking in the late 80s, 90s. And what does that mean to develop all of that and mature that along? How to implement, because Windows was brand new. Everything in the corporate world was using Microsoft, but it was also using those big beast and iron boxes of the day with mainframe computers and how to integrate and do a lot of different things. I made challenges all the way to the corporate level to prove how you can drive efficiencies by shifting and utilizing other types of workflow systems and computer systems. So I did a lot of that. Then came along this interesting creature that was out there that was initially developed and designed for the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy. Was started as a DARPA project, was in the universities, was a little bit in NASA, was a little bit here and there, but commercially wasn't really there. One of the sister companies that we had was Alascom, and up there they took a step of taking and doing this thing called the internet. Develop an internet business, telecommunications. I was forward thinking to the extent that I went to the vice president of engineering and of the company I was with and said, this thing coming up, this internet thing, eventually all telephony and television, video was going to be all transported in digital format. And he said, no way. There's no way you could take and move those analog signals of telephone and video into the digital realm and pump it over the infrastructure. And even at that time, that was the beginning of sonnet rings, if anybody understands the fiber infrastructure as telecom was starting to mature. So here we have the early telecom and let's talk about the 90s where these folks were just going, Tom, you're nuts. That's never going to happen. There's no way that you're going to be able to put those other types of analog technologies into a digital framework. Okay. Then why don't we develop here in the lower 48 instead of what Alaska is doing? Why don't we develop that down here in that lower 48 market? So we did. I wrote the business plan for that, developed that business model. And not only that, when I was able to finally push it through into the corporate environment with the risk analysis, then I had the great privilege of working with a young man that was extremely smarter than myself in developing the what was called the Border Gateway Protocol, BGP. But I also had the privilege of learning how to go out and hang dial-up modems in boxes with built-in routers into the central offices, wire that all up into a larger router, and pump that digitally across T1s. Wow, that was a lot of bandwidth. So, there were a lot of different things that were going on. So, something? I was there at the beginning, not like Al Gore, okay, and not claiming ever to be the father of the internet, because I know those guys from DARPA, I know those guys that were at the national labs that actually designed the protocols to make the internet work. But what I had the opportunity to do was in a telecommunications business environment to be able to go in from a ground zero in developing a business strategy and model and implementing dial-up servers and that in rural locations, rural telephony, pumping it across the existing infrastructure, and then having opportunities to move as technology moved into the light stream. The thing that bothers me today is that in envisioning the future, which I'll talk about in the next segment, I never, ever, ever envisioned that these young kids, because at the time the Zuckerberg, Muckerbergs, and all of the rest of the what I call the evil empire now, if we want to look at it from that perspective, and you want to put your Star Wars hat on, is that these people, I never envisioned them doing what they're doing today. Now, I will talk about in the second segment, because what I did see as I moved up the corporate ladder is where greed drives business decisions, where lack of virtue and immorality come into, and when I'm talking immorality, I'm talking business immorality, which there may be some personal immorality in there, but I am going to talk about personal virtue as well as public virtue and what that means all the way into the business climate. Because what we really have going on today, ladies and gentlemen, isn't just these techno-oligarchs and all of that. What we actually have is what I talk about all the time is from that biblical Reformation perspective, the battle of good and evil. And that no different than the idea that evil has to be contained. And the only way to contain it is to know what that opposition to evil is. And the only rationale around the opposition to evil isn't some humanistic determinant around that. It actually has to be what one knows from a relationship with the living God. Because other than having that relationship with the living God, you become your own God. And that's what these so-called techno-oligarchs, as I call them, have become. They're not masters of the universe. They're masters of their own mind, because what they have become is their own God. And therefore, evil becomes predominant. I never imagined that in the technology sector, because I saw the value of it. But at the same time, I saw that technology could be used in a negative manner if no morality was there to encircle it in a way. So when we come back into the next segment of Samuel Adams Returns, we're going to talk about virtue, public virtue, private virtue. We're going to touch back on the morality and what happened in the boardrooms. So I'll see you back here in a few minutes after this break. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to this very sobering program on Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they got it right, on Liberty Works Radio Network, a network that I greatly appreciate. It was interesting is that when I was letting people know this past week again that today was the last day that I'd be on Facebook, there were some people that were or are, because I don't think they've left yet, the Liberty Works Radio Network Facebook group or page. I don't remember what it was, and the question came across is that, are you going to leave the network? And I kind of chuckled about that and said, no, I'm not going to leave the network. I haven't heard from anybody in management of the network that they're ready to throw me off yet. So I do hope that the programming that I'm able to share with you has a value proposition that you would do two things. And I put one finger up, but do two things. And those two things is one, that you would support Liberty Works Radio Network because that's why I'm here. They've asked me to be here, and I do ask you to take a look at what's going on with them because they are that alternative in the audio realm to what is going on in the mainstream media. And you may not agree with all the programming on here. You may not agree with me. That's fine. The idea is that they have programming on here that cuts right to the truth. In fact, there's some of the programming on here that I don't necessarily agree with, but that's okay. They bring the truth for you to make your own decision upon. And that's what we need to do. And that's what the Facebooks, the Twitter Witters, Googles, Boogles, all of the others that are considered in what I call the techno-oligarchy is not doing. So second thing I want you to do is that I want you to go to SamuelAdamsReturns.net and bookmark that site, because that's where all the archives are going to be from now on for this programming. And to the extent as I can get the video moving on there, we're going to even blow off of YouTube because it's owned by Google. And you know what? They're starting to cut back. You know what they're doing to Prager, and they're doing to a whole bunch of other folks. I'm a little drip in the bucket of the ocean, with what I do in comparison to a lot of the other folks. But at the same time, the only way that we can impact these people is in their pocketbook. And if people of principle are looking for the government to take and make the difference, you're looking in the wrong place. You're looking in the wrong place. With that second point, I want you to sign up for the newsletter or one of the other checkbox items that are on SamuelAdamsReturns.net so that I can stay in communication with you. You can email me directly at tom@SamuelAdamsReturns.com, or you can find the email link there on the .net as well. But we need to stay in contact. Some people have asked me, and I'm going to tell you over and over again in these next few segments, Tom, where are you going? What are you doing? Well, what we're doing, and I gave you the big splash several months ago, back in June, July, I think it was, where we announced EagleFirePost.com. That is a part of Liberator Media, which is coming up in the near future. We're still developing that as a very local environment for getting news to folks in the local environment, and we'll grow that. But Eagle Fire Post is really you. You have to build the content. Goes to the story that when I changed telecommunications companies, I went to what became a competitive local exchange carrier, because there used to be competition. And this is the thing that's very frustrating for me, is that at that time in the 80s, what we saw was the divestiture of AT&T for the purposes of antitrust, if you will, under Judge Green's ruling, to the extent that new companies started popping up all over the place. So the one company that I ended up going to, we were a multi-billion-dollar company based on the valuation of all of the infrastructure. We put in fiber optics all over the place. We put in fiber optics that we owned all of, let's say, Hawaii. We owned a good portion of the undersea fiber optics between the islands, as well as we owned the majority of all of the microlink towers between the islands as well. We had fiber optics throughout the whole western United States, all the way down into Texas and Arizona. I used to have to travel all over, and we were putting in more fiber and more fiber and more fiber. It was doing some of the most advanced data experiments, DARPA programs that I was involved in, building the first gigabit type networks. We did that. It's supercomputing and putting supercomputers together on the network. So I've got a little bit of experience in taking from what I talked about in the last segment, from these dial-up servers, these boxes, which they were really, really cool boxes, and they got bought up by the Ciscos and the Discos and all of that they couldn't compete with, so they'd buy up all these really great little technologies and put their own garbage out there. But with that, what I did in telecommunications was to build an internet infrastructure that much of what is out there today is still riding on, especially in the fiber and the optical domain. Are there advances in optical routing and different aspects of telecom? Yeah. But I spoke at what was called ISPCon back in, I think it was somewhere around 1999. And I was one of the primary speakers in a session during that ISPCon, and I spoke on, basically, I used The Matrix, the movie The Matrix, as one of my as my topic, and showing that how we would interconnect everything all the way down to your refrigerators and your cell phones, everything you have, it would be all digitally interconnected. And that was something that I spoke about, predicted, if you will. And to this date, now what do we have? Now we have this Internet of Things out there, and the technology has come to that point where you can take your glasses and Bluetooth them into your other Bluetooth device. So it's become very, very interesting from a technological perspective, and all of the different value propositions that are there. But once again, never, ever, ever did I imagine that we would go from an entrepreneurial, divested environment into these mega corporations all over again. When finally, because of, I can't say all of the various reasons. I think some of the reasons is that one reason I'll tell you, at the company that I was at, ended up going bankrupt. And I was with the chairman of the board in developing, I was on the team of, there was only five of us. There were two finance guys, chairman of the board, myself, and the chief scientists that were putting together a restructuring plan for the company. But again, greed, evil thing. Greed is absolutely evil. And the power over others is the other evil thing out there. Would not allow us to do the restructuring. the mentality of the bondholders, and the primary bondholders being one of the larger New York banks, was that they would rather take 90 cents on the dollar than take and restructure the company, where we could have been the leading entity in the transition from the what we call tip and ring, or the analog to digital type of telecommunications, into a 100% digital environment. Because that's what the chief scientists and I were proposing, mapping out, showing that from an acquisition merger capability as well as a technological capability, because we were starting to build that already in this company, was how to be a full digital environment. I was sat on so many startup boards and advisory boards for the transitions into the digital realm and optical routing and so many different things. It was phenomenal at that date that I had the privilege to do those types of things and have input into what all of that meant. But once again, because of the greed of these mega bankers, they would rather take and allow the company to go into full dissolving the company, and just dissolve the company, sell off the assets, and really destroy the job market, if you will, of the people and the livelihoods of the 3,000 employees that we had in the company for their own personal gain. Okay, that's business, but where's the morality in that business? Okay, so what we're seeing here is that from that 1980s time frame, when we had divestiture, we had entrepreneurship, we had brilliant people doing a lot of brilliant things, it's all now wrapped up once again into mega companies. How many telecommunication companies are out there today? Not really that many. Everybody's moving to the cell phone environment. You really have no, a few that are out there that are pick up the, oh, how are you, phone and dial, that way. But that's rare. We can say that the greater percentage of people in America have, these things, have cell phones, and that's the primary means of communication. Same thing with what happened with the cable companies and satellite companies. The company I was at, we had a satellite company. We had several different markets in the Southwest, and I had to deal with all of that as well. And to see that those ended up getting, we had to sell those off to other companies that were satellite companies, so on and so forth. So what we see more is the aggregation instead of the divestiture, allowing independent operators and entrepreneurs to actually share in what is out there as a very rich environment for people to build businesses and enjoy the profitability within a fair market environment. The whole fallacy of free market, we can argue that in a different conversation. But what I want to bring to your point here as we close out on this second segment is that it comes back to, where is the morality in business? Where is the virtue, personal as well as the corporate virtue? Not the social justice garbage that's happening in the boardrooms today, or because these people are buying up all the stock in a company and driving it in a direction of all of this tolerance and sanity and stuff that is immoral, the immorality that's going on in business. No. What happened to the people who had values and moral integrity that would understand the virtues of the foundational principles upon which this nation was founded? We're not seeing them. We're not seeing them because of the, again, accumulation of power and wealth into the hands of a few. That's what we're dealing with. And the only way to impact that is to, as I said already, is what the founders did. They impacted the East India Trading Company in their pockets. And we're going to come back and talk some more about that as we come to the third segment of Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. Yes, they did. They got it right. Here on Liberty Works Radio Network, where liberty works for you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this last sobering segment of Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. Yes, they did. They got it right. As we're talking about leaving Facebook and why you should too. And I don't know. I'm doing it on principle. I'm doing it 100% on my belief of Samuel Adams in helping to write and define through those letters of correspondence the whole idea of the non-importation, non-consumption, and the non-exportation agreements that the colonies put together, the people, the patriots put together. And really, if you are looking at, again, I see an article here where Trump sets his sights on his most dangerous enemy and that it's going to be MAGA versus tech giants for the future of America. Well, that's interesting, but we can't depend on government to do that because it'll impact us in the long run. No. We need to look at the foundational principles, and that's what this program is all about. That's what Samuel Adams Returns is all about, is going back to those foundational fundamental principles upon which this nation was created, which means you. Which means that if you truly and absolutely believe in the foundational principles, which include the faith principles of this nation, then you know what? The non-importation, non-consumption, non-exportation agreement that the colonies, by virtue of their people coming together in convention, agreed on, stood on, acted on, to the extent that the young ladies in Boston said they would drink no more tea. They would not import any more cloth or use any cloth. You know what it did for America? It was an entrepreneurial explosion. We had to restart the forges that Great Britain shut down in the 1750s so that we could take and make our own iron, forge our own cannons, forge our own barrels for our guns, forge our own implements for our ships, our pulleys, our rivets, everything that we needed internally to America. You know, that was the real beginning of our industrial revolution in America, was that action against the East India Trading Company, that oligarchy, that, you know, government fostered oligarchy. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the things that I did not talk about in the last two segments relative to the telecommunications industry is that they can only make so much money as a regulated industry, but by golly gee, by golly day, do they ever get a whole bunch of grants. And the thing that is very disheartening with these techno-oligarchs is that they were heavily funded through the National Science Foundation, through the CIA, through the FBI, through the DOD, through the DOE, and I know that for a fact and reality because I worked on Department of Energy programs, and so these communications and these companies like the Google Woogles and so on and so forth, they got funding because guess what? In the high performance computing world, they began to work on different things. And Apple, I know that for a fact because of some of the very high security, let me just say, the real high security environments that I had a privilege to work within, that Apple was one of the really super players inside that environment. So when you see Amazon, little dweeb communist inside of Amazon saying they don't want to do their facial recognition for the government, the Department of Homeland Security, because they just don't think that that's all right. Well, you know what? Sorry, pal. The government already did those contracts and paid for that development of the company that they assumed they acquired to continue to pour money into it so that they could get their arms around it and have that evil grasp. Boy, I'll tell you what, do you ever take a look at the guy that's the CEO for Amazon? Yeah, I tell the story and I'll tell it again. I interviewed with him for a director of IT at the very beginning of the company. And I left and I went home and I told Kathy I'd never go to that place because that Bezos dude is evil. You can see it in his eyes. There you go. You have to have the willingness. You have to have the moral stamina. And maybe that's why I ended up, not staying in the technology world. I mean, I made it as the senior vice president of a telecommunications company. But through the bankruptcy and acquisition, I didn't stay, nor could I get into anywhere else because everywhere I was looking at what was happening in that corporate environment, I'm going, oh. And see, that's what the real question goes. When will the boardrooms, when will you, even as a stockholder, come back with your virtue and your moral temperance and fight the evil of all these other corporate buy-ups that are out there that are forcing immorality into businesses and all the various insanities? I mean, we could talk about them over and over and over. But let's talk about James Madison's teacher, his mentor, for a moment, and something here. And I only have a few minutes left, but I talked to you about John Witherspoon, and in John Witherspoon, in his lectures on moral philosophy, he goes on to say it once more, it is certain that virtue is as really connected with private as with public happiness, and yet to make the interest of the agent the only foundation of it seems so to narrow the mind and to be so destructive to the public and generous affections as to produce the most hurtful effects. If I were to lay down a few propositions on the foundation of virtue as a philosopher, they should be the following. And he goes through a list that I'm going to take number 1 and 2 quickly. Is from reason, contemplation, sentiment, and tradition, the being with a capital B, meaning God, and infinite perfection and excellence of God may be deduced, and therefore what he is and commands is virtue and duty. So that comes from God. So I guess the real first thing is none of these techno-oligarchs believe in God. They're humanist. That is the new religion in America, and that's why we suffer so many things. But that's a whole other putting on my theological hat that I'll have to do some. I keep threatening to do that. I just run out of time as the week goes on. But the bottom line is that what he's saying here is that is our duty under God is virtue and duty. Okay? Whatever he has implanted in uncorrupted nature as a principle is to be received as his will. Propensities resisted and contradicted by the inward principle of conscience are to be considered as inherent or contracted vice. You know, it comes down to what is vice versus virtue. Two is one of the things he says here is true virtue certainly promotes the general good, right? So when we see all this social justice garbage out there, because it is garbage, it's all humanistic, immoral, ungodly, is what social justice is. There's no other way to term it. What we have from Witherspoon here is that what he's saying is that true virtue certainly promotes the general good. And this may be made use of as an argument in doubtful cases to determine whether a particular principle is right or wrong. But to make the good of the whole our immediate principle of action, so that's talking about the social justice insanity, if you make that your principal action, it is putting ourselves in God's place and actually superseding the necessity and use of the particular principles of duty which he hath impressed upon the conscience. As to the whole, I believe the universe is faultless and perfect, but I'm unwilling to say it is the best possible system, because I am not able to understand such an argument, and because it seems to me absurd that infinite perfection should exhaust or limit itself by a created production. I don't have time to get into the rest of these arguments here, but what I was talking about earlier in the other two segments is that what I see is predominant here with these techno-oligarchs, these fascist feudal lords, is evil. I use those terms in the way that they should be used, and appropriately, is that they are evil. And they're evil because they do not understand their position before God, so what they're doing is exactly what Witherspoon was saying, is that they're placing themselves ahead of God, and yet calling it social justice. I even made a comment on to some other people who were asking, should the social justice warriors on the college campuses use such and such a technical platform to keep other speech from happening at the college campus? So I came back and commented on that, to that exact point, that number one, they don't understand the fundamentals of virtue, values, and morality from a foundational, fundamental perspective that sets the moral context of humanity in its rightful place. Hence, they are putting themselves as gods and determining that you and I have no voice if we don't take up their socialist, Marxist, leftist position. And remember, a socialist, Marxist, leftist is a humanist, and the only religion that they have are either atheism or humanism. They then, and therefore, placing themselves above God. Samuel Adams clearly understood, and he speaks of it over and over again, to which I want to leave you with this, is that when it comes to business, when it comes to anything, when it even comes to you pastors and churches out there, is that if you do not understand the full truths of the Bible and the way that the Reformation brought that truth of salvation in Jesus Christ and the extensibility of God across everything, and that means not only of the individual soul and spiritual perspective. Don't solely spiritualize everything. No, it's the extensibility of God into, one, Jesus reaches our individuality. He reaches into our family. He reaches into our businesses, and he reaches into our governments. If you cannot grasp that full transcendence of God, then you are missing the reality of what we had Witherspoon talking about. And as a result, then we have the oligarchs, the techno-oligarchs, promoting their evil, all of their immorality, and even amorality, instead of the truths that Samuel Adams promoted here on this program. And we'll get to it more when we come back next week, because Samuel Adams, he has returned.